Mafia boss disguises himself as a plant to trap his fiancée, and the ending is a shocking plot twist. Listen up, guys. The mob boss who ruled half of Chicago, Adrian Whitmore, has suddenly fallen ill and is bedridden. The beautiful Vanessa and her treacherous younger brother Lucas, overjoyed at their stroke of luck, stood beside the bed, whispering obscenities and plotting to seize the entire fortune, thinking the old man's feet were freezing cold. Little did I know the boss was just acting to test his character, Abikaf Muik. A shocking plot twist. The boss remained completely unfazed, listening to every word. Watch this spine-chilling plot twist as he rises up, slaps the traitors in the face, and snatches away the only maid who truly loves him.
"There's no need to struggle now, Mr. Whitmore," Na murmured, fluffing his pillow. "Sometimes the Lord asks a man to be still just so he can finally hear what's true, a thing he's long been too busy to hear." Her voice, unguarded and warm, filled the sterile glow of the hospital room. By Adrian Whitmore's bedside, Na Hayes held a damp cloth and a dry towel, the sleeves of her gray cardigan folded neatly at her elbows. She had just cleansed his brow and smoothed the blanket on his chest, a ritual she'd performed each morning for the 3 days since his admission to the private neurological floor. The only sounds were the steady beep of the cardiac monitor and the soft whisper of rain on the glass. As intended, Adrian remained perfectly still. His eyelids were sealed, his respiration slow and even. The bruise coloring his temple was convincing enough for any camera or medic outside his inner circle. To the world, Adrian Whitmore, the 40-year-old Mafia chieftain who held half of Chicago in a grip of fear, wealth, and order, was comatose, following a sudden collapse. But behind the facade of silence, Adrian was lucid. As Na reached to adjust the sheet by his shoulder, a painful fissure opened within him. "I'm sure you cannot hear me," she said, her gaze on his face marked by the candor of one who speaks only to ward off a crueler silence. "But I believe we never stop listening, even when the world can no longer hear us." She offered a fleeting, self-conscious smile and lowered her eyes to her hands. "My mother spoke to my father this way at the end," she continued softly. He had lost his voice, but she still described the weather, told him about the bills, what she was cooking for dinner. She paused. "She said love doesn't demand a reply. It simply remains because that is its nature." The words struck him, a pressure built behind his closed lids. For so long, his world had been built on elegant deceptions. Loyalty was a transaction, respect a product of fear, and lust was packaged as adoration. Yet no one had ever spoken of love as this simple, constant thing, made of daily reports and evening meals and the act of just staying. Nana carefully wrung the washcloth. "I believe you have been lonely for a very long time, Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice becoming softer. "And I suspect powerful men have their own unique brand of solitude. Everyone requires something of them until eventually no one knows how to simply give care." That remark pierced his defenses. A sharp ache bloomed in his chest, so immediate it felt tangible. This was not part of the act, not a symptom of his feigned illness, but something ancient and raw. It was the pain of being truly seen, and by the one person who sought nothing from him but his comfort. He fought the urge to open his eyes, to sit up and take her hand, to ask how she unraveled in days, a truth his world had missed for 2 decades. The timing was wrong, so he remained motionless as a single tear escaped and vanished into the linen. Na saw it as she reached to straighten the covers. She stopped, her brow furrowed as she observed the damp trace on the pillowcase. Then, with an impossibly gentle motion, she took a clean corner of the towel and blotted it dry. "Even the strongest men grow weary," she whispered. If this story has found a place in your heart, let us know where you are listening from tonight. Your voice is welcome here. Support us with a like, subscribe to our channel, and join us again for more tales of truth, allegiance, and quiet reckonings. A fire burned in Adrian's throat. Na placed the cloth into its bowl. She glanced at the IV line from sheer habit, trusting the nurses but checking anyway, and then collected her items. Before she left, she turned back one last time. "You are not alone," she stated. "Not today." She then departed, shutting the door with a reverence for the suffering of others. The room became quiet once more. Behind his eyelids, Adrian looked into blackness, breathing against the mounting pressure in his chest. He had designed this charade to reveal avarice, to peel back the masks to see who remained when his fortress seemed to have fallen. He had anticipated maneuvering. He had anticipated deceit. He had not anticipated this kind of pain. A wound Nana's words had found deep inside him, in a place that still remembered his mother, old sorrows, and the terrified boy he'd entombed under bespoke suits, secure elevators, and a fearsome reputation. Moments later, the door swung open. A shift in the air preceded any sound. Costly perfume, the sharp click of heels, the rustle of expensive clothes. It was Vanessa, his fiancée. She crossed the room with the easy authority of a woman accustomed to the halls of power. She was beautiful in that cold, perfect way that captivated donors, politicians, and lenses. She was dressed in black cashmere and diamond earrings, as if mourning and high fashion had made a pact. She stood by the bed for a long moment in silence. Then, Adrian felt her lean in, her breath so close it ghosted his ear. "You just had to do it like this, didn't you?" she breathed. The warmth was gone from her voice, replaced by a flat, weary irritation. "You can command a room of killers, but you can't handle your own damn stress." A soft sigh. "Do you have any idea the mess this leaves me to clean up?" Beneath the sheets, out of sight, Adrian's fingers curled into a tight fist. Vanessa adjusted an item on the nightstand, a gesture for some imaginary spectator, before leaning over him again. "The lawyers are demanding to know who holds temporary authority. Your father is being evasive. The board is getting agitated. Investors are circling, and I am the one who has to sit here and look grief-stricken." Her tone became glacial. "If you had a shred of consideration, Adrian, you would either wake up or have the decency to die and stop holding everyone up." The words felt like a physical blow. For a split second, a violent impulse nearly made him move. He wanted to lurch up, to grip the cuff of her cashmere sweater, and to demand just how long this poison had lived beneath her perfect skin. He wanted to witness genuine fear in her eyes. But instinct held him back. Not yet. The heat of his rage cooled into something hard. Convinced he was gone, Vanessa let out a sigh of pure frustration and walked to the window. Adrian heard the soft click of her phone being unlocked. Her voice changed, becoming intimate and low. "Hey," she said softly. "Yes, it's me." A beat of silence as Adrian listened. No movement, not a twitch. Another pause, followed by a quiet laugh he had never heard from her. "I told you, Lucas. He's not walking away from this one." Lucas! The name struck him with more force than her cruelty. Lucas Whitmore, his stepbrother, younger by 6 years, raised in the same house after his father's second marriage. Lucas was polished, charming, and weak where Adrian was disciplined. A man Adrian never fully trusted in their dealings, but one he never imagined capable of this. Vanessa kept her voice down, but Adrian heard everything. "I'm serious," she said. "The board's already skittish. If Richard keeps dragging his feet on the transition, we initiate the proxy play. The moment they prioritize stability, the vote is ours." She laughed that private low laugh again. "No, darling, I haven't forgotten." The penthouse, the offshore accounts, the lake house. It all gets simpler as soon as the legal team declares him permanently unresponsive. Adrian felt his heart thunder once, so violently he feared the monitor would betray his consciousness. Vanessa went on, her tone now lazy with confidence. "You were right. He was always too arrogant to believe anyone in his circle could ever outmaneuver him." She glanced at the bed. Adrian felt the weight of her gaze. "And frankly, Lucas, he made it simple. Men like Adrian always mistake fear for love." Lucas must have said something pleasing because her voice softened with something like affection. "I miss you too," she purred. "Tonight, same place, we'll review the asset schedule again." The asset schedule. Not grief, not shock, not even panic, a strategy, a plot to absorb his empire, his properties, his fortune together. The rage inside Adrian's body condensed into something heavier and far more lethal, a silent vow. He remained still, listening as Vanessa and his stepbrother conferred for another minute, detailing board members, necessary signatures, the family trust, and which executives were pliable enough to be swayed when the official prognosis worsened. When she finally hung up, Adrian was no longer in shock. He was transformed. Vanessa returned to his bedside, looked down, and with a breathtaking coldness placed her manicured hand on his motionless one. "To think," she murmured, faking a tenderness for no one, "I almost married you for love." She then collected her purse and departed. The door clicked shut. Silence filled the space, but it was nothing like the quiet Na had left. Na's silence had been a comfort. The silence Vanessa left behind was a poison. Adrian remained a statue of controlled muscle, his gaze fixed inward on a truth laid bare. Na had come to the man, while Vanessa had addressed the empire. One offered her presence, the other tallied his losses before they were final. He saw then that this ordeal was not about doubt, but about discovery. And as rain whispered against the hospital glass, Adrian Whitmore swore a silent oath from beneath the white sheets. He would not stir today. But when he rose, neither Vanessa Caldwell nor Lucas Whitmore would hold a single thing they had already started to claim. By noon, the hospital found a tempo that felt to Adrian like a courthouse, serene on its face, but churning with verdicts below. The exclusive neurology wing was crafted to soothe powerful families. Walls were softened by warm wood accents. The light was kept low, forgiving. Each morning, fresh flowers graced the nurses' station, though lilies were no longer among them. The coffee was passable, the guards were subtle, and the billing was kept discreet enough to leave dignity intact. It was the kind of environment where money could feign that suffering had been tamed. Adrian lay still, just listening. He had dedicated most of his adult life to knowing the chasm between words used for show and words spoken when a person was too weary to pretend. Hospitals exposed both. By the door, two nurses murmured updates on medication times and visitor lists. A neurologist appeared just past 11, shined a light in his pupils, scanned the monitor, then dictated his findings in a calm, rehearsed voice. Stable, unresponsive, no significant changes. Nathan Cole had performed his role flawlessly. The medical chart would sustain the illusion for as long as Adrian required. The one thing Adrian hadn't anticipated was how taxing the stillness would be. His body screamed from the lack of motion. A fire burned in his shoulders. A muscle deep in his back throbbed with a stubborn ache that intensified with every hour. Even his jaw felt weary from feigning relaxation. Command had always been his gift, but there is a world between choosing silence and being entombed by it. Shortly after noon, his father came. Richard Whitmore made no announcement of his arrival. He never did. Even at 70, his movements held the quiet power of a man who once changed the rhythm of a room just by entering it. His footsteps were nearly silent on the polished tile. He acknowledged the nurse with a courteous nod, waited for her to depart, and then pulled a chair to the bedside. He was quiet for a long moment. Adrian could sense him there, appraising him. Finally, Richard's low, arid voice broke the silence. "If I were a lesser man, I would think you'd finally devised a way to make others talk without you having to interrupt." Adrian gave no sign. Richard made a soft grunt, a sound of disappointment, though not of surprise. "Nathan tells me the board is on edge," he began. "That was to be expected. Panic always finds men in fine suits long before it finds those with real work to do." He went quiet. Vanessa was by earlier. A weighted silence hung in the air. Adrian felt a heat bloom beneath his ribs but forced his breathing to remain steady. Richard leaned back. "I saw her down the hall. She appeared more put out than worried." Another pause. "Your mother always said you see a person's true nature when they believe pain has given them a license." The sound of Catherine's name landed with force. Richard invoked her name only when truth was more vital than solace. "You were never adept at picking gentle women. You confused refinement with substance," he stated. He allowed the words to fill the space, then his voice changed, shedding a layer of its familiar steel. "But I have something else to tell you. The maid, she stayed the night after her work was done." Adrian's heart rate shifted, a change so faint most monitors would ignore it. The one beside his bed did not. Richard noticed. Of course he did. His voice stayed level. "A nurse dropped a tray in the hall after midnight. It was loud enough to startle the entire floor. That girl was out of the chair by the window before anyone had a chance to react." He gestured to the chair. She was afraid. Not theatrical fear, but genuine. Yet she went right for your door before she even knew what the noise was. Adrian held himself rigid, but a knot tightened deep inside him. Richard went on. "Fear speaks the truth far more quickly than love ever does. Do not forget that." A minute passed. He stood, straightened his cuff, and rested a wide hand on the bed's guardrail. "I will not ask if this is worth what it will cost you," he said, his voice low. "You are aware it may not be." He exhaled slowly. "But since you have begun this, you must see it through with open eyes. Do not turn away when the truth is not to your liking." And then he was gone. The room felt immense in his absence. Adrian lay in the quiet, turning his father's words over and over. Na had been afraid. That was the detail that mattered. He had no use for courage staged for an audience. The world he occupied had a surplus of that. But she had moved toward his door anyway. Toward a threat, toward the unknown, toward him. That thought remained with him deep into the afternoon. At 2:00, Vanessa came back, though her visit lasted less than 10 minutes. She was in a camel coat this time, a leather folio held under her arm. That folder spoke more of her concerns than anything else. She didn't take a seat. She stood by the end of the bed, scrolling through her phone, tapping out 2 replies before she looked at him with professionally crafted sadness. "I've been in touch with the family office," she murmured, her tone suggesting an intimacy that wasn't there. "There are some temporary papers that might require a signature, should this drag on." She angled her head. "I do hope you recognize all that I am managing for you." No hand came to his brow. No fingers checked his pulse. No waver in her voice. "Just business." She glanced at her own image in the dark screen of the television, tucked a single hair into place, and departed. Adrian heard the door click shut and knew a simple, brutal truth. Some people don't abandon you during a crisis. They just reclassify your pain as paperwork. The afternoon wore on. The rain yielded to a pale, watery winter sun, casting thin, cold light on the floor. A nurse tended to his IV. Laughter echoed from down the corridor, quickly muffled by an apology. A custodian whistled 3 notes from an old song that was just on the edge of Adrian's memory. Then, at 3:45, Na returned. He knew it was her before a word was spoken. Her walk was unlike anyone else's on this floor. Not more quiet, not more slow, more mindful, as if she navigated the world knowing it was filled with fragile things. She placed a small paper cup on the bedside table. From the aroma, it was coffee. Not for him. For her, he supposed. Then came the soft scrape of a chair being pulled near. "Good afternoon," she said, as if he were merely napping and might reply at will. He heard the rustle of pages. A book. Adrian waited. "I thought I would read to you," Na said. "Nothing medical this time. I had a feeling that if you can hear us in there, you must be getting sick of people talking about your reflexes." In some corner of his mind, against all odds, he felt the trace of a smile. She opened the novel and began to read, her voice even and low. It wasn't high drama. It sounded like an old American story. Simple, solid sentences about the seasons, about family, and about a small town trying to hold on to its soul through trying times. The sort of book his mother used to keep at the library because, as she would often say, not every truth requires a spectacle. After reading for a few minutes, Na paused. "My brother can't stand hospitals," she offered, her tone conversational. "He says they have the scent of anxiety and stale coffee." A brief quiet. "He's almost always right about these things." She sipped from her cup. "His name's Ben," she continued. 21, and he imagines he's more formidable than he is. He still shouts at the television when the Cubs play, as if the team can actually hear him. Her voice grew warmer talking about him. Adrian found he was listening with a focus that was no longer part of his test. "My mom always says sports are the closest thing some families have to church." Na let out a small laugh. "She also says that men find it easier to talk when they are looking at a game instead of at one another." That thought landed more softly than her words from the morning. But maybe for that reason it stayed with him. She was not attempting to win his favor. She was simply keeping him company. It was such a basic human gesture that Adrian felt a pang of shame at how seldom he encountered it. Nana turned another page. "I once wanted to be a doctor," she said after a moment. Not with self-pity, just with frankness. A surgeon, to be exact. I was drawn to the idea that some problems cannot be debated or outwitted or postponed. You simply have to put your hands right where the pain is and give it your all. The sentence hung in the air around him. Put your hands where the hurt is. No one he knew spoke that way. Not the board members, not Vanessa, not the men who raised glasses to him at galas or feared him in private rooms. Their world was built on leverage, on timing, on optics, on outcomes. Na's world was built on people. She read another page, then paused once more. "You know," she said softly, "my mother was raised in Indiana, a little town. Church every Sunday, pot roast afterward, neighbors who recalled your birthday even when they misplaced their own. She still mails thank you notes, real ones, written by hand. She says good manners are how we show each other we're not just animals." A pause. I believe she would feel pity for any man in a room this grand, if no one was taking the time to speak to him with kindness. Adrian felt a pressure build in his chest. He could see his own mother doing that very thing. Thank you notes written in blue ink, sent even to those below their social standing. True class, she had called it, is measured by how you treat someone from whom you have nothing to gain. It was a phrase he hadn't summoned from memory in years. Nina softly closed the book. "I should let you rest," she offered, though resting was all he'd done. She rose, smoothed the blanket yet again, and this time her hand lingered over his, a touch warmer and a moment longer than convention required. It wasn't intimate, nor was it careless. It was simply present. "If you have ever been truly loved," she whispered, "I hope some part of you remembers how to feel it." Then she withdrew. The door clicked shut, leaving Adrian in the deepening hush of the hospital room, staring into a darkness of his own making, while a machine dutifully confirmed his heart was still beating like a man in perfect control. But control was becoming a far more complex illusion. Outside this sanctuary, his fiancée was processing his absence like a clerical task. His stepbrother was circling his empire like a vulture at an auction. Men in tailored suits were assessing his vulnerability in fiscal quarters. And within these walls, a woman with weary eyes, a worn cardigan, and a voice that held only truth had just reminded him of a decency that power could never forge. For the first time since this charade began, Adrian no longer felt like a man observing an experiment. He felt like a soul being judged by it. As evening descended on Chicago, turning the hospital window to black glass, he lay perfectly still beneath the white linens. But inside, his world had already fractured into two stark, irrevocable halves. There were those who drew near when there was nothing to be had, and those who were already tallying their inheritance. By the dawn of the fourth day, Adrian Whitmore was learning that silence possesses a way of honing everything to a razor's edge. It honed memory. It honed insult. It honed the distinction between obligation and affection until the smallest act stood out in agonizing relief. The room was heated, but the light filtering through the large windows held the thin, stark quality of a late Chicago October. Clouds hung low, pressing down on the city. Beyond the glass, cars streamed along Lakeshore Drive, and the world proceeded with its unthinking rhythm. Men held meetings over breakfast. Women hurried their children to school. Shops opened their doors. Coffee was brewed. Invoices were settled, and Adrian Whitmore remained in a private suite, a statue beneath white sheets, while the people in his orbit prepared to dismantle his life. Shortly after 8, Nathan Cole entered. For nearly a decade, Nathan had been Adrian's doctor. But before that, he had been something far rarer in Adrian's world. A friend unafraid to speak harsh truths. He was in his late 40s, broad in the shoulders, and carried the rumpled, tired look of a man who had delivered too much bad news to families clinging to hope. He checked the monitor first, then the IV drip, before leaning in so close that his words were for Adrian alone. You're stretching this beyond what I recommended, Nathan murmured. Adrian did not stir. Nathan straightened, took the chart, and shifted to a louder, clinical tone for the camera in the corner. No discernible neurological activity, he announced, flipping a page. Then, quieter again, your pressure spiked yesterday afternoon. That was when Vanessa had phoned Lucas. Nathan put the chart away. I don't need a confession. The monitor tells me everything, whatever you overheard. It struck a nerve. He walked to the window, separated the blinds by a fraction, and let them snap shut. I'm not here to lecture you, he said. I know it's pointless, but I am here to remind you that deception is like a powerful sedative. Helpful when administered correctly, but fatal if you lose track of the dose. A ghost of a smile touched Adrian's lips. Nathan always had a flair for the medical metaphor. The doctor returned to the bedside, adjusting the blanket in a gesture that mimicked checking circulation. The board is asking for another update, he said. Vanessa has been calling twice a day, so has your stepbrother. That name again. In Adrian's mind, Lucas was transforming from family into something more like a contagion. Nathan's voice dropped even lower. And there's one more thing. The maid posed a question to me this morning. In the first time in hours, Adrian felt a sharp internal jolt. Nathan caught it. Yes, he breathed. That has your attention. He feigned an examination of Adrian's pupils with a penlight. She asked if patients in a coma could still perceive kindness, he relayed. Not medicine, not sensory protocols, kindness. And before you read too much into it, let me continue. She appeared exhausted and said she didn't want careless words spoken over you if the slightest chance remained that you could hear. Nathan switched off the light and took a step back. Your life is filled with people who understand the price of everything, he stated. That young woman appears to understand the value. Do not mistake one for the other. His demeanor shifted back to polished professional as a nurse came in with meds. He was gone 2 minutes later without another glance. Adrian lay motionless, but his mind was a storm of activity. Kindness. Nina had inquired about kindness. Not his prognosis, not his estate, not the corporate succession plan. He recalled his mother telling him once, when he was 19 and already dangerously brittle, the way young men become when sorrow outpaces wisdom, that cruelty was just fear in formal attire. At the time, he'd brushed it off as another of Catherine Whitmore's sentimental notions. But now, in a room where one woman offered patience and another brought predatory calculation, he began to question how many truths his mother had known that power had blinded him to. The answer arrived late that morning, embodied by Vanessa Caldwell. She swept in with her typical curated grace, but attention now hummed beneath the surface. Her heels clicked more sharply on the tile. Her smile was stretched thinner, her perfume more potent, as if she believed sheer expense could anchor a reality that was beginning to drift. Good morning, Adrian, she said, her tone devoid of any morning warmth. She claimed the chair by his bed, crossed her legs, and pulled out her phone before making any move to touch him. If she saw the contradiction, she showed no sign. I just left the Whitmore building on Whacker, she reported, as if he might find solace in corporate bulletins. Half the VPs look like they're at a wake they can't expense. There's instability everywhere. Do you have any idea what instability does to a company of this magnitude? She let the query linger in the air. Adrian heard the rustle of papers, a folder being opened. "I've prepared a memo in case your father can be convinced to make a temporary public statement," she went on. "A show of unity would be beneficial." Unity. She pronounced the word as if it were a legal clause. Vanessa finally laid her hand on his. Her fingers were cool, inert, resting upon him like an object placed there for a photograph. "I have been incredibly loyal to you," she said, her voice a soft poison. A chill passed through Adrian. "True loyalty has no need to announce itself." Vanessa remained seated for a few more minutes, perhaps thinking silence would confer upon her some kind of virtue. When it didn't, she stood and walked to the window. He recognized the quiet click of her phone unlocking. Then, after a quick check of the hallway, she dialed Lucas. "Don't begin," she whispered. "I'm already on edge. No, Richard is still refusing to commit to a transfer. He's dragging his feet." Her voice gained a sharp edge. "And the board will not act unless they believe the old man is failing too." Another pause. Adrian listened to her breathing, to the veiled confidence in her tone, to the sheer ugliness of two people who saw the future as a space they could decorate with their greed. "Yes, I've seen the trust paperwork, East," she said, her voice low. "There are weaknesses. We simply require more time." She gave a short, sharp laugh. "No, I'm not concerned about Adrian overhearing. If he ever wakes up, my sheer shock will have me in church every Sunday for a year." The remark was intended to be witty. Instead, it caused something inside Adrian to turn to ice. This wasn't anger. Anger was a hot, fleeting thing. This was colder. This was the part of a man that starts making choices that can never be reversed. Vanessa went on, her voice dropping to the intimate cadence she reserved for Adrian only when they were being watched. "I told you, Lucas, another week of this, and they'll be desperate for leadership. At that point, we won't have to take a thing. They'll offer it to us out of fear." A beat of silence. "Yes," she said, softer still. "I miss you too." The words contaminated the air in the room. Adrian had heard more than enough. When Vanessa finally disconnected and came back to the bed, she touched his shoulder with the display of theatrical affection. "You always had to make things more difficult than they needed to be," she murmured, "even now." And then she was gone. He lay in the quiet for a long while after, matching the rhythm of his own breaths to the machine beside him. His mother once told him that some betrayals don't break your heart because your love for the person is gone. They break it because you finally accept they never loved you at all. He understood now. The ache, however, was no longer for Vanessa. It was for the man he once was. A man who confused reverence with love, polish with principle, and stillness with integrity. A titan of industry could be brought to his knees by a single room. At 3, the atmosphere shifted. Nana entered with a new basin, a crisp towel, and a paper bag giving off the scent of soup and herbs. She had on the same gray cardigan, its cuff now bearing a neat, handmade stitch. Her hair was pulled back plainly, dark circles smudging the skin beneath her eyes. She placed the soup on the nightstand, then went to the window, angling the blind to shield Adrian's face from the light. "Still overcast," she murmured, picking up a conversation that never was. "My mother believes Chavez saves its finest weather for those who are confined." A quiet moment passed. She approached the bed, her hand reaching to straighten the blanket. But it froze when she saw the tension in his jaw. It was a faint, almost imperceptible hardening, but Nana saw it. "Oh," she breathed, more to herself than to him. Did someone trouble you? Adrienne felt his pulse quicken. She glanced at the door, then back to him. That must sound strange, she whispered. But rooms can feel different after some people leave, like opening an oven to find something has scorched while you were juggling other tasks. He would have chuckled if his body allowed. He could only listen. Nana soaked the cloth in warm water, gently cleansing one side of his face. When my father left, she began after a moment, my mother didn't utter a single unkind word for weeks. Not one. Then one morning over toast, she just said, I suppose he can go disappoint someone else now. A phantom smile was in her voice. That was her angriest pronouncement all year. She rinsed the cloth. I once thought strength was shouting, slamming doors, or winning an argument. Her voice grew softer. Now, I believe strength is holding on to your decency when someone gives you every reason to let it go. That sentence pierced Adrian with a terrible clarity, because decency, he understood, was the one virtue his power had never demanded of him. Efficiency, of course. Intellect, always. Boldness, without question. But decency? No. That was for his mother, for the women from church with their funeral casseroles, for men who rose when their elders entered a room, even with no one to impress, for people like Nina. She put the cloth down and picked up the towel. I am sorry if anyone has been thoughtless with you. If you can hear me, she said, I want you to know not everyone here wishes you ill. Not everyone. Such a simple, forgiving phrase. Then, with a slight pause, her hand came to rest over his for a fleeting instant. If you return, she whispered, I hope you return to something true. When she was gone, her words seemed to linger in the still air. Adrienne lay unmoving beneath the sheets as the city lights began to glow outside, the monitor marking a time he no longer felt. His trial had started as a test of loyalty. It was transforming into a judgment, for each passing hour exposed not just the character of those around him, but the man he had been among them. And for the first time in ages, Adrian Whitmore found that truth more punishing than any foe. The fifth day dawned under a pale, flat sky, carrying the strained silence of a metropolis that senses a tremor in one of its cornerstones. Adrian Whitmore remained inert under the crisp hospital linens, but his thoughts were moving with a precision he hadn't known for years. Immobility had burned away all distraction. The quiet had dissolved every illusion. Each voice that entered the room now registered differently. Some were practiced, some were tinged with fear, and one was genuine. At 5 a.m., the door swung open softly. Nina came in, holding a small bag and a thermos. A delicate scent of oatmeal, cinnamon, and coffee drifted in with her, an aroma so normal it felt alien amidst the sterile room and artificial light. Good morning, Mr. Whitmore, she said gently, as if addressing a man who was merely choosing not to speak. She put the thermos on the nightstand before checking the room's climate, nudging the thermostat up by 0.5 degrees. Adrian had always liked a warmer start to his mornings, a defense against Chicago's harsh winters. Nina had observed this in her first month at the penthouse, noting how his coffee cooled untouched on colder mornings. She went to the window, parting the blinds just enough for daylight to enter without being harsh. The rain has finally passed, it seems, she remarked softly. My brother claims the city feels purer after a storm. Adrienne heard her. He was starting to see that Nina often spoke in simple truths veiled as idle comments. She never sought to impress. Her words were never dramatic, yet nearly everything she said held a core of sincerity. After pouring herself some coffee in a paper cup, she opened the bag. "I made oatmeal," she offered. "The food here is uninspired. My mother says a warm breakfast makes the day feel less hostile." The word hostile hung in the silence. Nina took a seat by the bed, consulting a small notebook with a handwritten list. Adrian could hear the soft scrape of a pencil. "Medication timing, hydration levels, dim the lights," she murmured to herself. These were not her orders, not her duties, yet she performed them all. A sense of duty had molded her spirit long before she stepped into his orbit. After a time, her gaze rested on him. "The doctors say routine aids recovery," she said softly. "So I will speak to you like you are someone who matters." Her hands rested together in her lap. "My mother taught me that everyone deserves their dignity, most of all when they are vulnerable," she went on. "She said, dignity is the one thing poverty can't steal unless you hand it over." A familiar tightness gripped Adrian's chest. He tried to recall how many men of his acquaintance spoke of respect, but never once of dignity. Nina reached out, smoothing the blanket. "I cannot know your world," she said with candor, "but I suspect people are rarely honest around you." No, they were not. They maneuvered, they praised, they weighed every angle. Their questions were sculptures of intent. Very few were ever truly honest. "I was raised where people had loud disagreements," Nana continued, "but they also appeared when things fell apart. A broken car meant 3 neighbors arriving with tools. A lost job meant another pot of soup on the stove." A slight smile graced her lips. My mother calls community a refusal to let people vanish." Adrian felt that sentiment anchor itself within him. A refusal to let people vanish. In his world, people vanished constantly, some by design, others by circumstance. Nina picked up the book from the day before, but didn't open it right away. She glanced down the hall, confirming their solitude. When she spoke again, her voice was lower. "I know there is concern," she said. "The staff talks, families talk. They think powerful men are immune to suffering." She paused. "But misery doesn't check your net worth." The plainness of the line hit him with more force than any grand speech ever could. "Misery doesn't check your net worth." She started to read, her voice even and reassuring, telling the story of a farmer rebuilding after a long drought. Adrian's mind drifted from the plot. He focused instead on the rhythm of her speech, its steadiness, so devoid of fear or artifice. Partway through a chapter, Nina paused. "My brother repaired watches," she said unexpectedly. "Small ones, old ones everyone else had given up on." Her eyes flickered to Adrian's wrist, which was bare without its usual luxury timepiece. "He said timepieces are not complex," she went on. "They only need patience and a steady hand. He thought most broken things are never fixed because people hurry." Her gaze softened. "I suppose people are much the same." The thought resonated because Adrian Whitmore had forged an empire from velocity. Swift choices, swift results, swift fixes. Patience was a concept he had seldom entertained. Nana put the book aside and reached for the basin, testing the water's warmth before dabbing his forehead. "You feel tense today," she observed quietly, "even with your eyes closed." Her fingers rested for a moment at his temple. "I hope you heard no unkindness." Something inside Adrian stirred at her perception. She saw. She always saw. My father believed that words spoken near someone who can't answer back show the speaker's real nature. Nana added softly. Kindness is simple when a person can reply. True character is revealed when they can't. Her hand gently withdrew. A heavy quiet once again settled upon the room, only to be torn apart as the door swung open. Vanessa swept in, her presence more cutting than ever, the sharp clicks of her heels a rhythm of raw impatience. All pretense was gone. "Oh," she stated, her voice devoid of warmth as her gaze fell on Nina by the bedside. "You're still here?" Nina rose with practiced deference. "Yes, ma'am." Vanessa dropped her purse onto a table, her eyes darting to Adrian for a moment before she faced the window. "I've been on the phone with the lawyers," she announced to the glass. "This limbo is becoming a liability." Her gaze slid back to Nana. "You can wait in the hall." Nana showed the barest flicker of hesitation. "I was just concluding my duties, ma'am." A razor-thin smile touched Vanessa's lips. "Conclude them faster." With a silent grace that defied the room's chill, Nana collected the wash basin. As she moved past Adrian's bed, her hand made one last brief pass, smoothing the blanket. "He's not by himself," she murmured, the words meant only for him, a secret kept from Vanessa's ears. Then she was gone, the door closing with a soft click. In an instant, Vanessa's rigid control dissolved to a quiet sneer. "I'll never understand why the help feels the need to linger," she breathed. "It fosters the fantasy that this is still a home." She drew nearer to the bed, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You always had a weakness for the sentimental types," she said, a trace of annoyance in her tone. It made every negotiation a needlessly emotional affair. Adrian lay motionless. "You forged an entire empire from pure discipline," she went on, "yet you always let this kind of softness colonize your private life." Her voice gained a sharper edge. "Softness has a steep price." She glanced at her phone. "Yes, Lucas," she answered the moment the call connected. "I'm with him now." Adrian heard the immediate shift in her tone. It was now warmer, looser, dangerously intimate. "The board is getting agitated." "No, Pa, Richard is still playing the part. He's insisting this is a temporary situation." A beat of silence. "I've gone over the trust documents again. The second he's declared medically unfit, the transfer of control is cleaner than we ever dared to hope." Her voice descended even lower. Adrian was convinced loyalty was a byproduct of fear. He failed to grasp that fear evaporates the moment a better opportunity presents itself. A soft, dark laugh. "We'll proceed with caution." She listened as Lucas spoke. Then Vanessa's reply came, a soft caress. "Of course, I still want the lake house. I may not be sentimental, but I am certainly not a fool." Another pause. "No change in his condition. I told you it's just a matter of waiting." Adrian felt that slow, crushing pressure build in his chest once more, but the nature of the pain had transformed. The initial shock of betrayal was gone. In its place was a terrible, illuminating clarity. Each word she spoke was a confirmation of a truth his own illusion had kept hidden. Vanessa disconnected the call, her eyes drifting toward the bed. "You should have always chosen stability," she whispered. "Feelings are a fatal flaw in judgment." She retrieved her handbag. For whatever it's worth," she added, her tone almost throwaway, "you were once truly formidable." And then she was gone. The silence returned, but this time, for Adrian Whitmore, it held no uncertainty. It held only a profound, crystalline understanding of the elaborate test he had set in motion. All his life, power had been a shield, deflecting the truth. Now, in his feigned weakness, the truth was being revealed. And somewhere beyond the raw ambition, past the cold betrayal and the quiet hum of greed, one person continued to enter this room each day, not out of need, but from the simple belief that someone ought to. The morning of the 6th day dawned with a silence more profound than all the days that had come before. Through the hospital glass, Chicago carried on under a watery winter sun. But within the sterile confines of the private suite, a tension was gathering like a storm on a distant horizon, unseen, but felt by all. The nurses moved with a softer tread, their voices hushed, as if some primal instinct warned them that in the stillness behind Adrian Whitmore's closed eyelids, a silent reckoning was unfolding. Adrian had lost track of the hours. Time had ceased to be a linear progression. Now it was an accumulation. Every overheard voice, every whispered exchange, every small gesture of either genuine kindness or cold calculation was layering itself into a substance far heavier than mere days. He had orchestrated this grand deception to learn who would stand by him when his empire seemed to crumble. The one thing he had never anticipated was how deeply he himself would be altered while awaiting the answer. Just past 9, Nana came in, holding a small paper cup and a neatly folded cloth. The aroma of real chicken soup, warm and achingly familiar, gently filled the room, a scent no hospital kitchen could ever replicate. "Good morning, sir," she offered, her voice a quiet balm as she placed the container on the table. There was a fragile quality to her tone today, a sign of a sleepless night. Faint shadows rested beneath her eyes, yet her bearing was one of unbroken composure and respect. Adrian listened, his senses finely tuned. He was learning to distinguish the weariness of fatigue from the weight of despair. Nana bore the first, but never the second. "I've brought some soup from my home," she explained, her voice soft, though no one had asked. "My mother is convinced that broth aids the healing process. She believes the body holds the memory of kindness, even when the mind is adrift." She lifted the lid, allowing a small plume of steam to rise like a prayer in the cool air. "I truly hope she's right," she added. After a moment's pause, she moved toward him, her hand testing the air before she gently straightened the blanket covering his chest. Her actions were always the same, measured, thoughtful, and unhurried, born not from a lack of urgency, but from a profound respect for his vulnerability. Nana took a seat and spread the napkin over her lap. "I had a word with Dr. Cole this morning." Her voice dropped to a more confidential level. "He told me that recovery can be a quiet thing, that sometimes people return to us slowly in fragments." She looked down. "My mother, my Abba, she says faith is having a conviction in things that are not yet visible." Faith. The word hung in the air, foreign and strange. Faith was not a commodity in Adrian's world. There was only strategy, there was preparation, there was the cold calculus of probability. Faith demanded a surrender he had never learned. Nana stirred the untouched soup with a small spoon. "I cannot imagine the kind of existence you've led," she went on, "but I suspect not many people ever gave you permission to simply be still." Her voice softened. for most of his life, my father held down 2 jobs. He never let himself rest. The day he finally stopped was the day his own heart refused to go on. She paused, a faint, sad smile gracing her lips. He always said that a man can construct an entire world for himself and still forget to build a place within it that is safe enough to be human. Something inside Adrian's chest constricted at those words, safe enough to be human. He tried to remember the last time he had even considered such a place to be a necessity. Nana took a warm cloth and began to gently clean his hand, removing the sterile residue of antiseptic. "You may not be aware of this," she said in that same quiet tone, "but people observe powerful men the way children watch a thunderstorm from a distance. They are filled with curiosity, with fear, sometimes even with awe. But nobody ever wants to be standing where the lightning strikes." Her hand rested for a moment on his wrist. "I don't believe anyone is meant to live their entire life as a storm." That sentence landed with an impossible weight in the stillness of the room. Adrian could recall the first instance someone called him frightening. He was 24, newly at the helm of an enterprise his father had nearly lost to treachery. Fear had been his salvation. Fear had restored balance. Fear had built everything that followed. But fear had never once taken his hand. Nana rinsed the cloth, carefully patting his skin dry. "I hope," she said with a profound gentleness, "that when you finally awaken, there will be someone here to speak to you with complete honesty." The words were not theatrical. They demanded nothing. They were a simple offering of truth. She fell silent then, perhaps wondering if she had overstepped. But before she could rise, the door was thrown open. Vanessa stormed in, her face a mask of tight-lipped annoyance. She made no attempt to hide her displeasure. "I was under the impression that visiting hours were being restricted today," she said, her voice like ice as her eyes fixed on Nana. Nana was on her feet in an instant. "I will come back at another time," she replied, her own voice a study in calm politeness. Vanessa offered a curt nod, a gesture of dismissal, not acknowledgement. As Nana collected the soup she had brought, her gaze flickered to Adrian's face for a final moment, not seeking a sign, but simply affirming his presence. Then she departed. The room's atmosphere shifted back to ice. Vanessa slowly removed her coat, draping it over a chair as if claiming territory in a hostile negotiation. "I had a meeting with our legal team this morning," she stated, her words directed at the far wall. "They've confirmed our position." She began to pace toward the window. A temporary conservatorship becomes a permanent one if the neurological prognosis remains ambiguous. Her tone was pure calculation, utterly devoid of human concern. Adrian listened, commanding every muscle in his body to remain perfectly still. Vanessa turned her back to him, unlocking her phone. "Yes," she said into the receiver. "I just left their offices. Lucas, it was always Lucas. The board is getting anxious," she continued in a low murmur. "Our investors are starting to probe. No POA. Richard is still maintaining the facade that this is all temporary." Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "We just need one more week." A cold dread spread through Adrian. His entire life's work now reduced to a timetable. A week. For them, time was now just another asset to be leveraged. "Yes," Vanessa whispered. "If the specialist can confirm long-term cognitive impairment, the transfer of authority is automatic." A pause. "No." Adrian never planned for weakness. He only ever planned for dominance. A chillingly soft laugh followed, and that is precisely why this is all possible. The word possible echoed in the silent theater of Adrian's mind. He was only now beginning to comprehend the true timeline of this betrayal. Vanessa's voice melted into something that was almost tender. "I know," she murmured into the phone. "Soon, this whole pretense can finally be over." Pretend. The irony was a burning coal in his throat. He had constructed the illusion, but they had built their entire future inside of it. "Yes," she went on, "we'll reorganize the company immediately. Certain departments may push back, but they will yield to new leadership once they see it's required for stability. My father in the state." A brief silence. "I will see to that myself." Adrian's breathing held its rhythm, but inside him, the final embers of uncertainty were extinguished. Dropping the call, Vanessa walked to the bed. Her gaze lingered on his features for a few moments, as if searching for a final confirmation. "You truly thought you could manage every outcome," she murmured. Her voice held no malice, no warmth, only a clinical finding. "It never occurred to you that someone could observe you with the same precision you used on everyone else." She straightened his blanket with a gesture that felt like a performance. "For whatever it is worth," she continued evenly, "the lessons you taught were learned well." She then collected her coat and departed. The quiet she left in her wake seemed to possess a physical weight. Adrian lay perfectly still under the pristine white sheets. Inwardly, however, the man who checked into this hospital was gone, replaced by something new. He had orchestrated this elaborate lie to find loyalty. Instead, he had been handed the truth. And the truth, he now saw, demanded a reckoning, as the chasm between power and love had never been so stark. Power remained as long as there was something to gain. Love remained when everything was lost. And he knew with absolute certainty which of the two had been keeping watch by his bed. On the 7th day, the room had shed the feel of a hospital. It had become a courtroom where the verdict was being written long before the trial began. Under the white linen, Adrian Whitmore was a study in stillness, the monitor's steady beat measuring time with cold indifference. Beyond the window, Chicago was buried beneath a heavy winter sky, a shade of gray that pressed down on the world, silencing color, sound, and warmth. But within the room, a kind of clarity was taking hold. Each voice that now entered the space betrayed its owner's intent more swiftly. People speak differently when they believe they are with the unconscious. They let honesty spill from the cracks in their composure. They assume that silence is vacancy. And so, Adrian listened. Just after 8 in the morning, Nina slipped inside, holding a small canvas tote rather than her usual paper sack. She had on the same gray cardigan, but a soft blue scarf was draped loosely at her neck today, a small defense against the morning chill. A whisper of the outside world followed her in, carrying the scent of late autumn and the memory of smoke. "Good morning," she whispered. Her voice was quieter than usual, yet the familiar weariness was still faintly present. She set the tote on the nearby chair before nearing the bed. Her ritual was always the same: a check of the room's temperature, then an adjustment of the blinds to ensure the light touched the room gently, never falling directly on Adrian's face. "I brought a little something different," she said, her tone almost an apology. "My mother was baking bread last night. She has this belief that homemade bread makes everything better." From the tote, she drew a small parcel wrapped in cloth. A delicate scent of warm wheat and rosemary began to fill the space, pushing back against the sterile air with something deeply human. "She always says that we think medicine is what heals," Nana went on, carefully unwrapping the bread. "But real healing starts when someone remembers to see you as a person." Adrian took in every single word. She put the bread on the table, fully aware he couldn't eat it. Still, she had brought it, not for its function, but for its presence. Nana settled into the chair and opened her notebook. A few new lines had been written since yesterday. Adrian could just discern the soft sound of a turning page. "Your sleep seems troubled today," she observed quietly, her gaze drifting to the monitor. Sometimes the body holds on to stress, even when the mind is seemingly at peace. She paused for a moment before continuing. "My brother likes to say that storms reorder the air," she said. "After one passes, everything feels clearer, even if the world looks the same." Her hand moved to gently adjust the blanket's edge. "I imagine people are much the same." The thought lingered in the quiet air. Adrian noted how Nana never rushed to fill a silence. She left room for the thoughts in his head, respecting the conversation he could not have. After a beat, she picked up the book she'd brought before, but she didn't start reading right away. Instead, her words took on a more personal tone. "I saw my mother late yesterday evening," she began softly. "She was asking after you." A slight hesitation. I let her know you were holding steady. A faint, almost shy smile touched her lips. "She wanted me to tell you that pride can be the slowest path to recovery." In that counsel, Adrian could almost hear the echo of his own mother. Nana shifted in her chair. "My mother feels that pride is a fine tool for getting through the hard years," she explained. "But she warns it becomes a poison when it stops you from being able to accept kindness." Kindness. That word again. It was the currency Nana seemed to value above all ambition. She rested her hands in her lap. "I suppose powerful people are not often shown kindness that comes without a price," she mused. "So eventually they forget what it looks like." The statement landed with a quiet, devastating accuracy. Adrian tried to recall the last time someone had offered him anything without some hidden calculation. He couldn't. Nana started to read, her voice a calm current, telling a story of an old carpenter mending a farmhouse battered by a storm. The narrative was slow, patient, valuing process over results. She paused midway through a paragraph. "I've always loved stories about fixing things," she reflected. "Most people are impressed by new construction, but to restore something, you have to understand why it was precious to begin with." Her eyes flickered toward Adrian's unmoving form. "I believe we forget that sometimes." The words found a home deep inside Adrian. This idea of understanding why something was precious. His whole empire was a monument to survival, to necessity, to absolute control. But had he ever stopped to ask what, beyond that control, was truly precious? He wasn't sure anymore. Nina set the book aside. "I probably shouldn't talk your ear off so much," she said gently. "The nurses must think I'm using this place as my personal lounge." A hint of a smile was in her voice. "But these places feel a little less intimidating when you can hear someone speaking normally." She took up the warm cloth and began to softly clean his hand, easing the chapped feeling left by the constant antiseptics. "You know," she spoke after a long moment, "my mother is adamant that true loyalty can never be bought. She wrung out the cloth with care. She says, 'What is purchased is not loyalty. It is merely rented obedience.'" The weight of that phrase settled over Adrian with a cold finality. Rented obedience. He'd built a kingdom on it. She went on, speaking almost to herself. Real loyalty is usually quiet. It's showing up when there's no personal gain. It's staying put when no one else is looking. Her fingers came to rest on his wrist for a second, a brief, steady warmth. I suppose that must sound very old-fashioned, she confessed. No, Adrian thought. It sounded impossibly rare. Before she could continue, the door swung open. Vanessa was back, her energy filling the room, sharp, measured, and impatient. I did not realize the visiting policy had become so flexible, she stated, her voice cool. Nana was on her feet instantly. I was just on my way out. Vanessa gave a slight, dismissive nod. As Nana collected her things, she looked back at Adrian one last time. You are not alone in here, she said again quietly. And then she was gone. The moment the door clicked shut, Vanessa let out a sharp breath. I fail to see why the staff gets so personally attached, she said under her breath. It undermines their professionalism. She placed her handbag on a chair and began to pace. The board is getting anxious, she announced. But Adrian knew she was already preparing for her next call. She stopped by the window, phone in hand. Yes, she said once Lucas was on the line. We need to push this forward. Push this forward. The urgency was plain in her voice now. No. Waiting any longer just creates more instability. Investors have no patience for this kind of prolonged situation. She listened. Yes, I've consulted with the legal team again. Medical incapacitation is a term that can be interpreted with some latitude, especially when doctors foresee no quick change. Adrian listened, absorbing every syllable. Each word was another stone solidifying what he already knew. We don't have to appear forceful, Vanessa went on. We let our stated concern for the company be our guide. Her tone softened. Yes, once the transfer of authority is complete, the reorganization is unavoidable. A pause. Yes, I know. Adrian created a very efficient machine. It makes the transition that much simpler. She spoke of him as if he were an object. Something inside Adrian settled. All doubt finally gone. Vanessa finished her call and walked back to the bed. For a man who was always so methodical, she said quietly, You seem to have been completely unprepared for your own replacement. Her tone was almost matter-of-fact. You built your alliances on fear, she went on, and fear evaporates the moment a better opportunity presents itself. She gave the blanket a small, unthinking tug. You really should have picked a successor with more practicality. With that, she took her handbag and left him once more. The silence returned. But this time, it was not a silence of uncertainty. It was a silence filled with lessons. For his entire life, Adrian Whitmore had believed that control was power. Lying there, motionless, he was finally learning a much more dangerous truth. Control had long been the veil that kept truth from his eyes. For truth is not an announcement, it is a whisper, heard only in the space between one who measures your absence and one who stays, because to leave is unthinkable. By day 8, the very air in his hospital room had shifted, a change Adrian Whitmore could sense without sight. The frail hope that once hung in the room was hardening into a grim conclusion. Those who saw no future for him began to act on their belief. Their tolerance frayed, their vigilance waned, and their motives shed the disguise of careful language. Adrian now knew that time was not just a revealer of truth. Time was its quiet invitation to speak. Outside, the early winter sun cast a weak glare upon the glass monoliths of downtown Chicago. Beneath a washed-out sky, the lake held a metallic sheen. Unfeeling and immense, the city hummed on, oblivious to the silent judgment unfolding in a private room. At 10 minutes past 8, Nina arrived, a small brown bag in hand and a folded newspaper under her arm. Her pace was a fraction slower, yet her poise was undiminished. She brought with her the simple scents of toasted bread and steeped tea, a fragile warmth from the world of morning kitchens. "Good morning," she offered, her voice unusually soft. Colored by a certain thoughtfulness, she placed the bag on the side table, then softened the light by adjusting the curtains to shield Adrienne's face. The gesture was now a familiar comfort, a small ritual in the quiet room. "I visited my mother's place before coming here," she explained softly, pouring tea into a paper cup. "She insisted I bring you this." From the bag, she withdrew a slice of apple bread, neatly wrapped, and set it by the thermos. She believes cinnamon helps with the loneliness of winter. There was no apology in the statement. Nina never felt the need to excuse small acts of kindness. She trusted them. After checking his IV drip and smoothing his blanket, she settled into the bedside chair, slowly unfolding the paper. "I thought I might read to you today," she began. "Not the news. The news seldom does anyone any good." A shadow of a smile touched her voice. "It's a piece about libraries in small towns," she went on, her gaze falling to the page. "About communities that keep them going, even when the money runs out." She paused, reflecting. "My mother believes libraries endure because people still need a quiet place, a room where no one demands anything of them." Adrian heard her. The concept of a space free from demand felt alien. His entire life had been lived in rooms saturated with expectation. For his leadership, for his resilience, for his command. The liberty to just be was a gift he had seldom been given. Nina folded the paper with care. "I imagine everyone needs somewhere they aren't being measured," she murmured. Her gaze flickered to Adrian's still features. "Even the strong." She picked up a warm cloth and began to gently cleanse his hand, her touch deliberate and calm. "You know," she added in a lower tone, "my brother told me something once, after a very hard year." A brief hesitation, as if weighing the words. He said, "The ones who stand by you in the silent struggle are the ones who know what loyalty truly is." Her fingers came to rest on Adrienne's wrist, not the ones who make the grand speeches. The sentiment struck a deep chord. Adrienne's life had been filled with speeches, pledges of allegiance, declarations of respect, pronouncements of admiration, but few had ever simply remained in the quiet. Nina's voice dropped even lower. "I can't know the battles you've been through," she said with care. "But I hope that when you wake, you'll know that not all connections have to be defended with armor." Armor. Adrian knew armor intimately. He had worn it his whole life, certain of its protection. He wondered now how much sincerity it had deflected. Na sat in silence, as if leaving room for thoughts she could never hear. And then, the door swung open. Vanessa entered, her movements tight with a controlled urgency, her posture more rigid than before. She had on a dark wool coat and clutched a leather folder under her arm like a shield. Her face was a mask of tension she no longer tried to hide. "I require privacy," she stated, her words clipping the air as she saw Nina. Nina stood without protest. "Of course." While collecting her things, she made one last, almost unconscious adjustment to the blanket. "You're not alone," she whispered, too low for Vanessa's ears. And then she was gone. Vanessa held her breath until the latch clicked shut, then let it out in a sharp sigh. "This can't go on forever," she muttered. She paced toward the window before unlocking her phone. "Yes," she answered quietly into it. "Lucas again." Adrienne listened, every sense focused. "The board is starting to doubt Richard's judgment," Vanessa reported. "He is refusing to face the facts." A pause. "Yes, the doctors are using guarded terms, but the lack of progress points toward a long-term impairment." Her voice grew colder. "We must get ready for a transition. Sooner, not later." She said the word now without flinching. Adrian lay completely still. "Yes," Vanessa whispered. "The legal team has confirmed that protracted incapacity is grounds for structural changes." She listened, a faint, mirthless laugh escaping her. "No, I have no guilt. Adrian always taught us that emotional attachment is a liability." Another beat of silence. "Yes. The moment authority is transferred, any resistance will collapse." Something within Adrian settled into a cold, hard certainty. The fantasy of their loyalty was now fully gone. Vanessa's tone became almost gentle. "We will manage the public narrative with care," she said. "Sympathy is a useful tool for ensuring cooperation." Sympathy and even compassion had been weaponized into strategy. "Yes," she went on. "Once we have the board, distributing the assets is just a formality." Adrian heard the clinical phrasing. They were already carving up his world into shares, his empire, his properties, his very name, all just an opportunity. Vanessa spoke even more softly. "I know," she murmured. "Soon, none of this will need to be a secret." Adrian felt no surprise, just a profound and chilling clarity. Ending the call, Vanessa walked to the bed. "For a man of your intellect," she said with detached calm, "you had a poor understanding of people." She examined his motionless face. "You thought fear was a chain that secured loyalty." She gave a slight shake of her head. "Fear only secures silence, nothing else." She retrieved her coat. "You should have been more careful about who you trusted." And then she too was gone. Silence returned to the room, but it was a new kind of silence, for Adrian Whitmore now saw the complete architecture of the treachery that surrounded him. Vanessa and Lucas thought they were watching a man weaken. In reality, they were exposing themselves, and every word they uttered pushed Adrian closer to the day his own silence would end. For the time being, however, he lay motionless beneath the crisp white sheets, observing, cataloging, and letting the truth have its final say. On the 9th morning, the room was no longer a space of doubt. It had become the quiet chamber before a sentence is delivered. The winter sun climbed over Chicago, throwing long, silvery light against the glass of the skyscrapers. The city pulsed with its usual rhythm, trains pulling in, offices humming to life, people moving into a new day, all trusting in the stability of the world they knew. But stability, as Adrian Whitmore now grasped, was so often just a well-tended mirage. He rested under the white hospital linens, the heart monitor's steady beat marking the passage of time. Within him, however, his mind had found a focus he had not known in decades. The shock was gone. The rage had cooled. All that was left was resolve. At 10 minutes past 8, the door eased open, and Nana came in, holding a small bouquet of simple white daisies in brown paper. The flowers were humble next to the opulent arrangements sent to men of his stature. but they carried something far more valuable than prestige. They carried truth. "Good morning," she said, her voice a quiet anchor, though Adrian detected a flicker of worry just beneath the surface. She set the flowers by the window where they could catch the light but not be overwhelmed by it. "My mother insisted I bring a bit of life into the room," Nana explained. "She claims that healing requires a reminder that the world keeps turning." She adjusted the blinds with care, letting the morning light soften the room's sterile edges. "I believe she worries that sterile environments can make a person feel forgotten," she added softly. Nina checked the room's temperature, the IV, and the blanket, each movement a small, attentive act that had grown familiar. This routine had become her quiet offering of constancy. Taking the chair beside his bed, she folded her hands in her lap for a moment as if to gather her thoughts. "I spoke to Dr. Cole this morning," she stated plainly. "He says that progress is possible." Possible. Such a tiny word to bear so much weight. "My mother believes hope is a duty," Na reflected, "something we are bound to uphold, especially when it's difficult." Adrian absorbed her words. Hope was an intruder in this sterile room. He had anticipated calculation, impatience, and well-rehearsed sorrow. But this woman, who had no stake in his survival, had brought it with her. Na took the warm cloth, wiping his hand with a gentleness that respected the IV line. "You know," she murmured, "so many believe strength is about dominance." She paused. "My mother says real strength is deciding who you will be when all your power is gone." That thought landed with the weight of truth, for power had been Adrian's entire world. Power had raised his kingdom. Power had been his shield, and power had been his cage. For an instant, Na's fingers brushed against the pulse in his wrist. "I can't know the choices that brought you here," she added softly. "But I think a person can find a new path, no matter how late in life." A ghost of a smile touched Adrian's thoughts. At 40 years old, he was young enough to start over, but old enough to carry a lifetime of regrets. Faint footsteps in the corridor drew Na's gaze to the door. "I suspect you have not trusted many people," she observed. "In a hard world, trust is a luxury." She folded the cloth precisely. "My mother calls it a slow thing, like the sun rising in winter." The image remained, unhurried, quiet, and unyielding. She sat with him in a shared silence for several minutes, never rushing to fill the void. Suddenly, the door swung open. Vanessa strode in, her urgency a stark contrast to past visits. She clutched a stack of documents, her composure worn thin by impatience. "I need a moment alone," she stated, her gaze falling on Na. Na was on her feet instantly. "I'll be back later." As she moved past his bed, she lightly smoothed his blanket. "You are not alone in this," she whispered, and then she was gone. Vanessa waited for the click at the door before raising her phone. "Yes." She breathed into it the moment the call went through. "It's about Lucas again." "It is always Lucas," Adrian thought, detecting a new edge in her voice. "There's more pressure now, less time." "The board meeting is happening sooner," Vanessa reported in a low tone. "They fear that any uncertainty will damage investor trust." "Pa." "Yes," Richard continues to block any talk of permanent incapacitation. A flicker of sharpness entered her voice. "He still thinks Adrian is coming back." A beat of silence. Vanessa's face hardened. "We have to get confirmation." Adrian lay perfectly still. "The neurologists offer no guarantees of his recovery," she went on. That ambiguity is to our advantage. Advantage. The word felt colder than ever. Yes, Vanessa confirmed softly. With a formal declaration of incapacity, the transfer of power will be seamless. Pa, no, the risk is almost zero. Her voice dropped to a near whisper. He never planned for his own weakness? A strange lucidity settled over Adrian. He had never accounted for vulnerability in his plans, until this moment. Vanessa stepped closer, her voice a quiet, sharp thing. The company can't be without a leader, she murmured, her words laced with impatience. Markets despise a vacuum. Another pause for Lucas's response. Yes, she agreed. We move with discretion. Discretion. The word was a delicate veil for ambition. Adrian knew that rhythm well, strategy masked as care. After ending the call, Vanessa looked down at his still body. You were so certain that power was a shield against betrayal, she said, her voice devoid of remorse. But no fortress is immune to human ambition. She straightened his blanket. Maybe now you'll finally understand that control is an illusion. An illusion. Adrian held the word in his mind. If control was an illusion, then so was this betrayal, and so was his silence. Vanessa gathered her papers and exited the room. The door shut with a soft click. The quiet returned, but it was changed. This was a silence with a known ending, because Adrian Whitmore now understood the exact moment that was coming, the moment his stillness would become his weapon. He had heard what he needed to. He had learned what he needed to. He had discovered who stood by him when there was nothing left to gain. Beyond the hospital glass, the winter sun bled across the Chicago horizon, painting long shadows on the towers that once represented his power. Underneath the white sheets, Adrian felt the steady beat of the monitor, a metronome counting down the seconds. For days he had let them think he was lost to them, unable to hear, to understand, to act. But the truth had been spoken, and his silence was about to break. Dawn broke with a stark beauty. The Chicago sky was a clean, pale canvas, the kind of quiet light that arrives after days of cold rain. Light spilled through the large hospital window, illuminating the white daisies Nana had left yesterday. Their simple form caught the morning sun without pretense, content only to be. Adrian Whitmore hadn't truly slept. While his body lay inert for days, his mind had replayed memories and voices, wrestling with the jarring fact that the deepest truths had come not from allies or lovers, but from a woman with no reason to be honest. But today, the stillness had served its purpose. The truth had been revealed. At 7:40 a.m., the door opened softly. Not entered, carrying that familiar tote bag. A thoughtful look crossed her face, as if she could feel a change in the room she could not yet see. Good morning, she greeted him quietly. Her tone was even, but her eyes lingered on his face a fraction longer than before. She set her bag down, checked the room's temperature, and turned the daisies to better catch the sun. My mother always said flowers seek out warmth, she remarked softly. We are much the same. She poured some tea and placed her notebook next to it. I spoke with Dr. Cole this morning, she said. He sees indications of neurological stability. A gentle pause followed. That suggests the body knows how to heal itself. Adrian clung to each word. In the past 9 days, many had spoken over him. But Na's words never felt rehearsed. She spoke as if language had weight, as if compassion mattered. She took her seat by his bed, her hands resting in her lap. You know, she began, a thoughtful tone in her voice. My mother believes that life offers us these moments, chances to start over. To start over. The concept felt alien. Adrienne Whitmore had always pushed forward, never looking back. Failures were buried, flaws concealed, and pain was swallowed in silence. But to begin again, that was an act of humility. Na reached out, smoothing his blanket with a practiced motion. "I don't know what burdens you carry," she said in a low voice, "but I hope that when you awaken, you will choose forgiveness over pride." The words hung in the still air. Forgiveness over pride. Adrian had built his life on pride. It had brought him immense power, and it had left him utterly alone. Na's fingers rested on his wrist, a fleeting warm touch. "I believe everyone deserves a chance to become who they were always meant to be," she whispered. A small, private smile touched her lips. "My mother says regret is wasted unless it guides you to a better place." Adrian felt the last of his hesitation fall away. His empire was built on swift, decisive moves. Clarity now demanded nothing less. Just before Nana could rise, the door flew open. Vanessa entered, radiating impatience, her body tense and her gaze sharp. She clutched a leather folder, her phone already active in her hand. "I require privacy," she commanded. Na stood without a word. "Of course." While gathering her bag, she made one last gentle adjustment to his blanket. "Remember, you're not alone," she murmured, and then she was gone. The door clicked shut. Vanessa let out a tense breath and unlocked her phone. "Yes," she said into it, the call having already connected. "It's Lucas. It was always Lucas." Adrian listened, his thoughts now a calm, cold river. "The neurologist's findings are still ambiguous," Vanessa stated quietly, "but the board's patience is wearing thin. Pa, yes. Richard is still trying to stop the transition." Her voice dropped lower. "We have to move before he can consolidate power. Pa, yes. Once his incapacity is on the record, the authority shifts to us." Her tone grew almost soothing. "The investors need to see confidence." Confidence. Adrian lay completely still. Vanessa drifted closer to the bed. "He never saw this coming," she said softly into the phone. "Pa, no. He put too much faith in his own control." A brief silence. "Yes, Lucas. All the pieces are in place. The very last piece. All the pieces are in place." Adrian's eyes opened. Vanessa froze, her words catching in her throat. The blood drained from her face as she stared down at him, her phone slipping in her grip. For a long moment, there was only silence between them. The heart monitor beeped on, indifferent to the world that had just shattered. Adrian's gaze was calm, direct, and completely undeniably aware. "Hello, Vanessa," he stated, his voice low. Her mouth opened, but sound failed her. The call ended. Calculation gave way to shock. Confidence crumbled into fear. "You," she breathed. Adrian pushed himself into a sitting position, removing the oxygen cannula with a steady hand. "I heard it all," he said. There was no rage in his voice, which terrified her more. Vanessa took a step back, her composure shattering against the hard truth. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly." His tone was unwavering. "You mistook my silence for surrender." She scanned his features for a hint of weakness and found only resolve. "Your planning was swift," Adrienne noted evenly. "Efficient." Vanessa scrambled to regain her poise. "We acted to save the company," she insisted, but his gaze held her fast. "You acted to save yourselves." A heavy silence fell. For 9 days, he murmured. Her feigned affection was a ghost in the room. Her confidence crumbled. You feigned love, he said. Her voice hardened, admitting he was never easy to love, a brutal honesty that almost earned his respect. Adrian pressed a button, and in walked Nathan Cole and Richard Whitmore. Vanessa finally understood the performance was never hers alone. Nathan calmly noted this would simplify the paperwork. Richard Whitmore regarded Vanessa with icy clarity. You misjudged patience, he stated. Vanessa remained silent. No words remained. Within the hour, the directives were sent. Vanessa Caldwell was severed from all Whitmore financial authority. Lucas Whitmore's corporate access was frozen. The silence that followed felt clean. Later, Nana arrived unaware and froze in the doorway. She saw Adrian sitting by the window, draped in winter sun. For a long second, she couldn't move, her look shifting from confusion to stunned disbelief. You're awake, she whispered. Adrian met her eyes. Yes. Relief, then doubt washed over her face. I am glad, she offered, setting a small gift aside, hesitant to come closer. You remained, he stated quietly. She demurred. It was my job. No, he countered softly. It was not. A quiet settled between them. You were honest with a man you thought was lost to the world? Adrian said. Nina's gaze fell. Everyone merits dignity, she replied softly. He moved nearer. For the very first time, he said, someone stayed when there was nothing left to take. Her expression grew uncertain, unsure of his direction. I was wrong about many things, he conceded, his tone unwavering, but not about this. He drew a small velvet box from his pocket. Nana's eyes widened. This is a surprise, she breathed. As were you, he returned, opening it to show a simple diamond ring. Not for show, but for substance. I have known only people impressed by strength, he said, holding her gaze. You were the first to wonder if I was human. Tears welled in her eyes. I cannot offer a simple life, he went on, but I can offer a true one. The silence between them was charged. I want to create something real, Adrian said softly. Her voice trembled. You barely know me. I know what matters, he replied. You stayed when it was easier to walk away. Her breath hitched. That tells me everything. For a long beat, she was still. Then a slow nod. Not for the fortune, nor for the influence, but for the sincerity that had finally found its way into a life of strategy. Beyond the glass, the sun washed over a city he once controlled by fear. Now he considered building something stronger. This story shows us that force can command obedience, but loyalty is earned only through kindness. True character is forged not in ease, but in utter loss. The ones who stand by us at our lowest point are those who truly see us. Wealth and power might win admiration, but they cannot build authentic love. In the end, sincerity and compassion hold a power that fear will never possess. Justice is not always a storm. Sometimes it is the quiet moment truth appears, and the soul chooses what is real over what is easy. This is a work of fiction created with assistance from artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and scenarios are fictitious and do not portray any real individuals or true accounts. The content is meant for storytelling and to illustrate emotion.